A quiet evening at a suburban gas station took an unsettling turn when Keanu Reeves, an ordinary citizen, noticed something off. A little girl in the backseat of an old sedan clutching her doll too tightly, her eyes silently pleading for help. What started as an unremarkable stop spiraled into a race against time to uncover a sinister truth. The night was unusually calm as Keanu pulled into the gas station, the faint buzz of overhead lights blending with the rhythmic sound of the pump. He glanced at his watch, 8:43 p.m. It had been an uneventful evening, the kind that lulls one into a sense of routine. But Keanu, sharp as ever, knew better than to assume all was well. Quiet nights often hid their own troubles. As he filled his tank, his gaze drifted to a sedan pulling into a nearby parking spot. The car was old, its engine rattling as it idled. Behind the wheel was a man in his late 40s, neatly dressed in a button-down shirt, his hair impeccably combed. He carried an air of forced calmness, a demeanor too polished for the hour. Keanu's eyes narrowed as he noticed the girl in the back seat. She looked no older than 7, her blonde hair framing a pale, stiff face. She clutched a doll so tightly her knuckles were white, her small body rigid as if trying to disappear into the seat. Keanu's instincts kicked in. He wasn't one to meddle, but something about the scene gnawed at him. Grabbing a bottle of water from his car, he approached the man, offering a casual smile. "Evening, everything all right here?" The man turned, his expression warm yet measured, like a rehearsed performance. "Good evening. Yes, we're just heading home after a late family dinner. My daughter Emily is exhausted, as you can see." Keanu glanced at the girl, her faint smile failing to reach her eyes. "Emily, huh?" he said gently. "You okay back there?" The girl's smile wavered, and for a moment her gaze met his. "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man, who introduced himself as Stephen Blake, quickly interjected, "She's just tired. It's been a long day." Keanu nodded, though unease stirred within him. "Where's home?" he asked, keeping his tone light. "Just outside of town, near Meadowbrook Lane," Stephen replied too quickly. Keanu's eyes flicked back to the girl. Her movements were stilted, her gaze darting nervously around the car. When Stephen placed a hand on her shoulder, Keanu noticed how she subtly recoiled, shrinking away as if on instinct. "You seem like a devoted father," Keanu said, testing the waters. "It's nice to see family spending time together, even if it's late." Stephen chuckled, though the sound was hollow. "Family is everything," he said with a tight smile. "But we should get going. It's been a long night." Keanu nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He stepped back, forcing a polite smile. "Drive safe." "Will do. Have a good night," Stephen replied, his tone a little too eager. As the sedan pulled away, Keanu stood by his car, heart heavy with doubt. Something about the girl's silent plea stayed with him, urging him to act before it was too late. The faint glow of the gas station lights flickered as Keanu Reeves watched the old sedan disappear into the night. His hand rested unconsciously on the car door, unease gnawing at him. The interaction replayed in his mind, the man's overly polite demeanor, the girl's unsettling stillness, the subtle flinch she gave when he touched her shoulder. None of it felt right. Keanu couldn't shake the image of her clutching the doll, her knuckles white with tension. Returning to his car, he grabbed a notepad and jotted down the license plate, 4A3X992. The night returned to its usual quiet, but his thoughts raced. Something about the encounter lingered like a shadow in his mind. He didn't know what was wrong, but he knew enough to trust his instincts. Back at his small apartment, Keanu couldn't relax. He sat at his cluttered desk, ignoring the unfinished projects and overdue bills. Instead, he flipped open his notebook, staring at the license plate he had written down. The interaction wouldn't let him go. The man's polished demeanor, the girl's rigid posture, her pale face, and that faint smile, it all felt off, like a puzzle missing a critical piece. Keanu opened his laptop, typing the license plate into an online vehicle registration database. As the search processed, he tapped his fingers anxiously on the desk. When the results appeared, they confirmed what the man had said. Stephen Blake, Meadowbrook Lane. On paper, he seemed clean, just another ordinary citizen. But Keanu knew better than to trust appearances. He leaned closer to the screen, his eyes scanning every detail. Frustrated by the lack of leads, he connected his phone to his car's dash cam, and played back the footage of the encounter. The grainy video showed him approaching the sedan. The man's smile, forced and eager, came into focus. Keanu fast-forwarded to the moment the camera caught the girl's face. Her eyes darted around, avoiding his, as though searching for an escape route. Replaying the footage, Keanu noticed something. He leaned in, rewound, and slowed the video. There, just for a second, her lips moved. He played it back again, focusing on the faint motion. 2 words formed, barely perceptible. "Help me." The realization hit him hard, his breath catching in his chest. She had been trying to communicate, pleading silently without alerting the man. The weight of the situation fell into place like a crashing wave. This wasn't just an unsettling encounter, it was something much darker. Keanu's heart raced as he reopened the search engine and delved deeper into Stephen Blake's background. Broadening the search to include other regions, he began to uncover a disturbing pattern. Blake's name appeared in multiple reports, interviews about missing children, tips alleging suspicious behavior around playgrounds, and vague, unproven connections to disappearances. No charges had ever been filed, but wherever Blake went, children vanished. A chill ran through Keanu as he opened another tab, searching for recent Amber Alerts. His chest tightened when he found one matching the girl's description. Emily Harper, age 7, blonde hair, blue eyes, reported missing 3 days ago from Ridgefield, about 50 miles away. She had been playing at a park when she disappeared. Witnesses described a man in a dark sedan near the scene shortly before her disappearance. Keanu clenched his fists as the pieces clicked together with terrifying clarity. Emily wasn't Stephen Blake's daughter. She wasn't returning from a family dinner. She was a missing child, and Blake was her abductor. Panic and anger surged within him. He had let them go. He had watched them drive away into the night, unable to act without concrete evidence. Now a little girl's life was in danger. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, slamming his fist on the desk. Without wasting another second, he grabbed his phone and dialed the authorities. "This is Keanu Reeves. I need an alert put out on a dark sedan, license plate 4A3X992, registered to Stephen Blake. Possible child abduction case." As he hung up, Keanu stared at the screen, the haunting image of Emily's whispered plea etched into his mind. He wouldn't stop now. He couldn't. Time was running out, and he was determined to make it right. "The child matches an active Amber Alert. Notify Ridgefield PD and coordinate immediately." The dispatcher's voice came through Keanu Reeves' phone, calm but urgent. "Copy that," Keanu replied, pacing the small confines of his apartment. His mind raced, but sitting and waiting wasn't an option. He needed to act. Pulling up a map on his laptop, he traced potential routes the sedan might take. Meadowbrook Lane was listed as Stephen Blake's address, but Keanu doubted that was his destination. If Blake had managed to stay under the radar for this long, he wouldn't be reckless enough to lead authorities straight to his home. Keanu replayed the encounter in his mind. Blake had been calm, too calm. People hiding something often tried to overcompensate. And Emily, her silence, her rigid posture, her barely perceptible flinch, they weren't the actions of a tired child. They were the actions of someone terrified, someone trying not to provoke their captor. He sat down again, typing up a report of the encounter and attaching the dashcam footage. Keanu flagged it for Detective Laura Mills, someone he trusted implicitly. She had the experience to coordinate with the Ridgefield Task Force. But even as he hit send, he knew waiting for bureaucracy to act wasn't an option. Time was slipping away, and Emily needed him now. Grabbing his jacket, Keanu headed for the door, his resolve hardening. He didn't know exactly where Blake was heading, but he was determined to figure it out. Emily's face, her whispered plea for help, stayed burned into his mind. He wouldn't rest until she was safe. As he stepped into the cool night air, his phone buzzed again. "Keanu, this is dispatch. Ridgefield PD confirms the Amber Alert. They're requesting coordination. Task force is en route to Meadowbrook Lane to check the address." "Copy that," Keanu said, already climbing into his car. The engine roared to life as his hands gripped the wheel tightly. The weight of the situation pressed on him, but he pushed it aside. There was no room for hesitation. A child's life depended on him. The quiet suburban streets, which had seemed so mundane hours earlier, now felt like a maze, one he had to navigate quickly. As his tires rolled over the pavement, Keanu dialed Detective Mills, his grip tightening on the wheel with every ring. The dispatch confirmation of Emily Harper's Amber Alert filled his mind, every passing minute an eternity. "Reeves," Detective Mills answered on the second ring, her tone brisk as always. "Laura, it's me," Keanu said, his voice clipped. "We've got a situation. I stopped a sedan earlier tonight. Stephen Blake was the driver. In the back seat was a little girl, white, blonde, around 7. Something felt off, but I let them go. I ran the plates and reviewed the footage. It's her, Laura, Emily Harper, missing from Ridgefield 3 days ago." There was a brief silence before Detective Mills spoke, her tone sharp. "You're telling me you let her go?" Keanu clenched his teeth, the weight of his earlier decision pressing harder. "Yeah, I didn't have anything solid to hold them on at the time, but now we know. Blake has a record linked to child abductions, even if nothing ever stuck. He's our guy." Mills let out a frustrated breath. "Damn it, Keanu, do we have a lead on where he might be?" Keanu's knuckles whitened against the steering wheel. "Not yet, but we need to act fast. He's not going back to Meadowbrook Lane. It's too obvious. I'll keep searching, but we need all hands on this." "Agreed," Mills replied, her tone steady. "I'll get Ridgefield on board. Let's bring her home, Keanu." As he hung up, the urgency of the moment settled over him. The quiet streets stretched ahead, but Keanu's focus never wavered. He wouldn't let Emily's faint cry for help go unanswered. "It's Keanu. All right, give me everything you've got on him. License plate, last known address, vehicle description. I'll loop in the Ridgefield task force." "We need to move fast," Laura Mills said, her voice sharp over the call. "I'm sending you the dashcam footage and my report now," Keanu replied, his free hand already typing on his laptop. "Dispatch has put it out in APB, but I doubt he's headed back to the listed address. If he's smart, and he seems like he is, he's going to try to move her tonight. He knows we're on to him." Laura's voice hardened. "Then we don't have time to wait. Let me pull up his file and see if there are any patterns. Does he have family, known associates, or favorite places to hide?" "I'm digging into that now," Keanu said, his jaw clenched. "But this guy's slippery. He's been linked to similar cases across multiple states. But nothing's ever stuck. He knows how to stay invisible." "Not for long," Laura said firmly. "Meet me at the precinct in 20. We'll map out a search plan and coordinate with Ridgefield." "On my way," Keanu said, ending the call as he floored the gas pedal. Back at the precinct, tension filled the air as Keanu and Laura pored over Stephen Blake's file. The records were a maddening mix of vague connections and near misses. Blake had been questioned in multiple states, always in connection with missing children, but he had never been charged. He was slippery, methodical, and far too good at covering his tracks. "He's got a pattern," Laura said, scrolling through the file. "He targets public spaces, parks, playgrounds, anywhere kids might wander off. The kids disappear, and he keeps them for a few days before moving them. No one knows where he takes them, but by the time authorities close in, he's already gone." Keanu leaned over her shoulder, his jaw tight. "He won't disappear this time. Not if we get to him first." Laura glanced up at him, her expression unreadable. "You're taking this personally." "Damn right I am," Keanu said, his voice low but intense. "I had her, Laura. She was right there in front of me, and I let her go. That's on me. I'm not letting him slip through my fingers again." Laura sighed, softening her tone. "Look, I get it, but beating yourself up won't help us find her. We need to stay focused. If he's planning to move her, we need to think like him. Where would he go? What's his next move?" Keanu ran a hand over his face, trying to push down the frustration boiling inside him. If he's been at this for years, he's got a system. He doesn't take risks, which means he probably has a predetermined location. Somewhere secluded, somewhere he knows he won't be disturbed. "Agreed," Laura said, her fingers flying over the keyboard. She pulled up a map of the surrounding area, marking key points of interest. "Let's start with the obvious. His listed address on Meadowbrook Lane is a long shot, but we'll have units check it anyway. Beyond that, we need to look at motels, rest stops, and any isolated properties he might use." Keanu nodded, already scanning the map. "What about Ridgefield? If he took her from there, he might still have a connection to the area." Good point, Laura said. I'll loop in Ridgefield PD and see if they've got any leads on associates or places he's known to frequent. Her phone buzzed. She read the message quickly and looked up, her expression urgent. Ridgefield just flagged an old hunting cabin about 30 miles out. It's owned by Steven's uncle, but hasn't been used in years. Could be worth checking out. Keanu grabbed his jacket. I'll head there now. I'm coming with you, Laura said, grabbing her keys. The drive to the cabin was tense. The narrow, unpaved road leading to the property was overgrown with weeds, and the headlights barely cut through the thick darkness. When the cabin came into view, it was a dilapidated wooden structure that looked as though it might collapse under its own weight. Keanu and Laura parked their cars at a distance and approached on foot, flashlights in hand. The beams of light cut through the night as they scanned the area. The cabin's windows were boarded up, and the front door hung slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. Keanu's heart pounded as they stepped onto the creaking porch, every instinct screaming that time was running out. "Dispatch, this is Laura Mills," she said into her radio, her voice steady. "We're at the location, proceeding with caution." "Copy that," came the reply. Keanu glanced at Laura, a silent understanding passing between them. They nodded to each other and pushed the door open, ready for whatever lay inside. The dispatcher confirmed, "Copy that." Keanu pushed the door open, his flashlight slicing through the musty darkness. The cabin's interior was barren, dust-covered furniture and cobwebs in every corner. It was clear no one had been there in years. "Nothing," Laura muttered, her flashlight sweeping the empty room. "If he's got a system, he's already one step ahead." Keanu clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling up. "We're running out of time." Laura nodded. "We'll regroup. Let's focus on his last known movements. People like him don't stray far from their comfort zones." Keanu's eyes narrowed as he thought back to the neighborhood where he had first pulled over Stephen Blake. Then that's where we'll start. The neighborhood was eerily quiet as Keanu parked his car on the corner of the street where he had stopped Blake just hours earlier. Porch lights flickered weakly in the still night, casting faint halos onto the cracked sidewalks. Stepping out of his car, Keanu's boots crunched against the gravel shoulder as he scanned the area. The weight of his earlier decision hung heavy on him. He had let them go, looked Emily Harper in the eyes and let her disappear into the night with a man he now knew to be a predator. He wouldn't make that mistake again. Keanu walked up the block, knocking on doors and hoping someone had seen something. Most residents were hesitant, peering through cracked doors or windows with suspicion. Finally, an older woman wrapped in a fleece robe cracked her door open just wide enough to see him. "Sorry to bother you, ma'am," Keanu began, holding up his badge. "I'm investigating a missing child case. Have you seen a dark sedan in the area earlier tonight? White man driving, little girl in the back seat?" The woman frowned, her brow creasing in thought. "I think I did. It was parked right there," she said, pointing to the curb near her house. "Didn't think much of it, but the driver kept looking around, like he was checking if anyone was watching." Keanu's pulse quickened. "Did you see which way they went?" "No, but the little girl in the back seat caught my eye," the woman continued. "She looked scared, poor thing. I thought it was strange, but I didn't want to assume anything." Keanu nodded, the confirmation solidifying his growing dread. "Thank you, ma'am. If you think of anything else, don't hesitate to call." He handed her his card before heading back to his car. His thoughts raced. Blake wasn't moving randomly. There was a calculated pattern to his stops. But why this neighborhood? What connection did he have here? As Keanu climbed into his car, his radio crackled to life. "Keanu, this is dispatch. We've received a tip from a diner waitress south of your location. She reports seeing a man matching Stephen Blake's description with a young girl earlier tonight. He appeared agitated and the girl looked distressed." Keanu grabbed the radio mic, gripping it tightly. "What's the address?" The dispatcher relayed the location, a roadside diner just off the highway, not far from where Blake was last seen. Keanu punched the address into his GPS and hit the gas, the unease in his chest now a burning fire. He was closing in, but every second felt like an eternity. Keanu pulled into the gas station where he had initially encountered Blake, hoping to retrace his steps. The fluorescent lights buzzed above the empty lot, casting stark shadows across the concrete. Inside, a young attendant leaned on the counter, scrolling through his phone. Keanu walked in, his badge already in hand. "Evening," he said briskly. "I'm Keanu Reeves. I need to ask you a few questions. The attendant straightened, shoving his phone into his pocket. Sure, what's this about? I'm looking for someone who might have passed through here earlier tonight, Keanu began, his voice steady. Dark sedan, older model. White man, mid-40s, traveling with a little girl about 7 years old, blonde hair. Did you see them? The attendant furrowed his brow, thinking. Yeah, actually, they were here a few hours ago, maybe around 7. The guy filled up his tank and grabbed a couple of snacks. The girl had this little doll she was holding on to. What about the man? Keanu pressed, leaning closer. Did he do or say anything unusual? The young man hesitated, unease clouding his face. He seemed off, like he was in a hurry but trying not to show it. The girl dropped her doll on the way out, and when she bent to pick it up, he snapped at her, called her stupid. She looked scared, but she didn't say anything, just grabbed the doll and got back in the car. Keanu's stomach turned, the image of Emily's trembling hands clutching the doll flashing in his mind. Did you notice which direction they went? Yeah, the attendant said, nodding. They turned onto Pine Street, headed south toward the highway. Keanu pulled out his notebook, jotting down the details. Thanks. If you think of anything else, give me a call. He handed the attendant his card and stepped outside, the cool night air hitting him like a slap. The clock was ticking, and Keanu knew the stakes couldn't be higher. He wouldn't stop until Emily was safe. Keanu leaned against the hood of his car, his mind racing. Stephen Blake wasn't just a predator. He was a ticking time bomb. The tension in Emily's posture, the way she had recoiled from him, now painted a picture that Keanu couldn't ignore. Before he could leave, his phone buzzed again. Keanu, this is dispatch. The diner waitress has additional details. She says the man seemed agitated and mentioned something about needing a place to stay. It's possible he's still in the area. Keanu straightened, his pulse quickening. What's the location? The dispatcher gave the address and Keanu was already in his car before they finished. On my way, he replied, pulling out of the lot with urgency. His hands gripped the wheel tightly as he sped through the quiet streets. The diner was only a few miles south. Its location was perfect for someone like Stephen, on the edge of town, near the highway, but isolated enough to avoid attention. As Keanu approached, the diner's neon open 24 hours sign flickered faintly in the dark. He parked near the entrance, taking a deep breath while scanning the parking lot for the dark sedan. There were only a few scattered cars, none of them matching Stephen's vehicle. Stepping out of his car, Keanu's boots crunched against the gravel as he approached the door. His heart pounded, a mix of adrenaline and determination propelling him forward. The waitress inside had seen them. She might have the lead he needed to track Stephen down. The bell above the diner door chimed softly as Keanu stepped inside. The smell of coffee and fried food washed over him, mingling with the faint buzz of fluorescent lights illuminating the nearly empty space. Behind the counter, a middle-aged waitress with tired eyes glanced up. Her name tag read Linda. You must be the guy I called, Linda said, straightening up. About the man with the little girl. Keanu nodded, his focus razor sharp. That's right, I'm Keanu Reeves. Tell me everything you saw. Linda set the rag down, folding her arms across her chest. They came in maybe an hour or two ago. He ordered coffee and a burger, but the way he talked to the girl, it wasn't right. She looked scared, kept fidgeting with her doll. He snapped at her when she didn't sit still, told her to act normal. Poor thing didn't say a word the whole time, just sat there staring at her plate. Keanu's jaw tightened. Did he say anything that stood out? Anything about where he might be heading? She nodded. Yeah, he was on the phone at one point, said something about needing a place to stay for the night. There's a motel just down the highway, Lakeside Inn. It's a real dump, but it's the closest place around. Did he seem like he was in a hurry? Keanu asked, his mind already racing ahead. Linda hesitated. Not exactly, but he kept checking the door like he was paranoid someone was watching him. Thank you, Keanu said, handing her his card. If you remember anything else, give me a call. Linda nodded, her concern etched deeply into her face. You find that girl, okay? She didn't look safe with him. Keanu tipped his head in acknowledgement before quickly exiting the diner, his adrenaline spiking. Outside, he pulled out his phone and called Laura. I've got a lead, Keanu said, his voice tight. Stephen might be holed up at the Lakeside Inn off Highway 7. It's the closest motel, and the waitress said he mentioned needing a place to stay. I'm already en route, Laura replied. I'll meet you there in 10. Keanu jumped into his car and sped off, leaving his sirens off to avoid drawing attention. The road stretched out before him, dark and empty, save for the occasional car passing in the opposite direction. His hands gripped the wheel, his eyes locked on the horizon. He couldn't let Emily slip away. Not again. The Lakeside Inn came into view, its neon sign flickering against the night sky like a failing heartbeat. The place was every bit as grimy as Linda had described. The parking lot was cracked and uneven, with weeds poking through the asphalt. A few cars sat scattered haphazardly, their windows fogged up. The building itself was a single-story row of rooms with peeling paint and dim porch lights that barely illuminated the doorways. Keanu spotted Laura's unmarked car parked near the far end of the lot. Pulling up beside her, he stepped out of his vehicle, his heart pounding as he approached. Laura rolled down her window, her expression tense. I checked with the clerk, Laura said, her voice low but urgent. Stephen's car is here. He checked into room 12 about half an hour ago. Keanu's eyes darted to the far end of the row of rooms, where faint light seeped through the curtains of room 12. Do we know if the girl's with him? He asked. Laura nodded grimly. The clerk said she was. She looked scared, but Stephen brushed it off, said she was just tired. Keanu clenched his fists, the image of Emily's blank, terrified face flashing in his mind. We can't wait any longer. We need to move. Laura placed a firm hand on his arm. Keanu, we have to be smart about this. If we go in guns blazing, he might panic and hurt her. Let's stake it out, wait for an opening. Reluctantly, Keanu nodded. They took up positions in the shadows across from the room, their eyes locked on the partially drawn curtains. Inside, Stephen paced back and forth, his movements agitated and restless. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, clutching her doll tightly. Even from a distance, Keanu could see the tension in her small frame, the way her shoulders hunched as if trying to make herself invisible. The minutes dragged by, each one an eternity. Keanu watched Stephen mutter to himself, his gestures growing more erratic. The thought of Emily in danger gnawed at Keanu like a raw wound. Every fiber of his being screamed to act, but he forced himself to stay rooted in place. Finally, Stephen grabbed a pack of cigarettes from the bedside table and stepped toward the door. Keanu's heart leapt. This is it, he whispered to Laura. They watched as Stephen stepped outside, a lit cigarette dangling from his lips. He stood on the small porch, oblivious to the officers hidden in the shadows. Keanu exchanged a glance with Laura, who nodded. Now, she said. Keanu moved quickly and silently, his feet crunching softly on the gravel. Stephen didn't notice him until it was too late. Keanu grabbed him from behind, twisting his arm and forcing him to drop the cigarette. Stephen let out a yelp of pain as Keanu pinned him against the wall. Stephen Blake, Keanu growled, you're under arrest for the abduction of Emily Harper. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Stephen struggled, his voice a mixture of panic and anger. You've got it all wrong. She's my daughter. Save it, Laura said, stepping forward and snapping a pair of handcuffs onto his wrists. We'll sort it out downtown. Stephen spat on the ground, glaring at them with wild eyes. You don't know what you're doing. You're making a mistake. Ignoring his protest, Keanu hauled Stephen toward his car while Laura secured the room. But before they could take a breath, a loud noise came from the woods behind the motel, a rustling that made Keanu freeze. What the hell was that? Laura muttered, her hand instinctively moving to her weapon. Keanu turned sharply, scanning the tree line with narrowed eyes. Stay with him. I'll check it out. Before Keanu could take a step, Emily bolted out of the room, her small figure darting toward the woods. Emily! Keanu shouted, his voice cutting through the night. She didn't stop, her frantic movements a blur in the darkness. Within seconds, she disappeared into the trees. Keanu's pulse surged with urgency, but before he could follow, something else caught his attention. A faint shadow moving along the edge of the woods. The forest loomed like a shadowy labyrinth as Keanu plunged into its depths, flashlight in hand. The air was damp, carrying the earthy scent of wet leaves and soil. Branches clawed at his clothes, but he pressed on, the faint sound of Emily's cries spurring him forward. His breath came heavy and fast, his heart pounding as the darkness closed in around him. Emily! Keanu called, his voice echoing through the stillness. "It's me, Keanu. I'm here to help you." The faint beam of his flashlight scanned the dense underbrush, illuminating twisted roots and tangled brambles. Every crack of a branch underfoot made him flinch, his nerves wound tight. The woods felt alive, every rustle and whisper of the wind a reminder of how vulnerable they were out here. A faint whimper reached his ears, barely audible over the sound of his own heartbeat. Keanu froze, turning toward the direction of the sound. "Emily," he called again, softer this time. "I'm coming to get you. Stay where you are." He took another cautious step forward, but a chill ran down his spine. Something didn't feel right. It wasn't just Emily's cries he was hearing. There was something else. Someone else. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he realized he wasn't alone. Back at the motel, Laura tightened her grip on Stephen Blake, who sneered at her despite his restrained hands. "You think you've won, don't you?" he growled, his voice laced with venom. "You're wasting your time." "Shut up," Laura snapped, her eyes darting to the edge of the forest. She could still faintly hear Keanu's shouts, but the dense trees had swallowed him. Something about Stephen's smug expression made her uneasy. "You have no idea what's out there," Stephen said, his tone almost gleeful. "You're going to regret this." Laura glared at him, but quickly refocused on the woods, her hand resting on her weapon. The forest felt alive with tension, and Keanu was out there alone. Her gut twisted with unease as Stephen's words echoed in her mind. Laura wouldn't be able to help if something went wrong. Keanu pressed on, his flashlight slicing through the oppressive darkness. The whimpers grew louder, guiding him deeper into the woods, but the unsettling feeling that he was being followed refused to leave him. He paused, ears straining for any sound beyond Emily's cries. A twig snapped behind him. Keanu whirled around, his flashlight sweeping through the trees. The beam revealed nothing but shadows and swaying branches. His hand instinctively moved to the holster at his side, but he didn't draw his weapon. Not yet. "Emily, it's okay," he said, his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. "I'm here. I'll keep you safe." Another sound, a rustling, came from his left. He pivoted, his flashlight landing on a cluster of trees. For a split second, he thought he saw movement, a shadow slipping between the trunks. His grip on the flashlight tightened, his pulse quickening. Whoever was out here wasn't just watching, they were circling. "Who's there?" Keanu demanded, his voice firm. "Show yourself!" Silence. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the usual symphony of nocturnal life eerily absent. Keanu took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help him, or Emily. He moved cautiously toward the sound of her cries, now more distinct. "Emily, I'm close, just hold on," he called. Finally, he spotted a small clearing ahead. The faint outline of a figure crouched near the base of a tree came into view. "Emily!" Relief flooded through him as he quickened his pace. But his elation was short-lived. A heavy footfall sounded directly behind him, followed by the unmistakable metallic click of a knife being unsheathed. Keanu turned just in time to see the blade glinting in the faint light of his flashlight. A man stepped out of the shadows, his face obscured by a dark hoodie, his posture low and predatory. This wasn't a random bystander. This was Stephen Blake's accomplice. "Stay back!" Keanu ordered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. He shifted his stance, angling his body to shield Emily, who was still huddled near the tree. The man didn't respond. He lunged, the knife flashing toward Keanu's chest. Keanu dodged, the blade slicing through the air inches from his shoulder. He swung his flashlight like a baton, striking the man's wrist. The knife clattered to the ground, but the attacker was relentless, shoving Keanu backward into a tree. Pain shot through Keanu's back as he collided with the rough bark, but he stayed on his feet. He grabbed the man's arm, twisting it behind his back in a practiced motion. The man snarled, slamming his elbow into Keanu's ribs. The blow knocked the wind out of him, but Keanu didn't let go. "Run, Emily!" Keanu shouted, his voice strained. "Go now!" The girl hesitated, her wide eyes darting between Keanu and the fight unfolding before her. "Go!" he repeated, his tone desperate. Emily scrambled to her feet, clutching her doll tightly as she darted into the thicker part of the woods. Keanu let out a breath of relief, but there was no time to dwell on it. The man twisted free of his grip, his hands clawing for the knife on the ground. Keanu kicked it out of reach and tackled the man, both of them crashing to the forest floor. They grappled in the dirt, the man thrashing wildly, his strength fueled by desperation. Keanu managed to pin him down, but not before the attacker raked his nails across Keanu's arm, leaving deep scratches. "Stay down," Keanu growled, his knee pressing into the man's back. He reached for his radio with one hand, but the man bucked beneath him, nearly throwing him off. Keanu gritted his teeth, his arm throbbing from the deep scratches. He wrestled the man's arms into position, snapping one cuff onto his wrist before forcing the other arm into place. The man let out a guttural scream, but Keanu didn't relent. Finally, the cuffs clicked into place and the struggle ended. The cuffs clicked shut, and the fight was over. Keanu Reeves hauled the man to his feet, panting heavily. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "Why are you helping him?" The man didn't answer, his face twisted into a sneer. Keanu shook him once, his patience wearing thin. "Talk." But the man only laughed, a low, menacing sound. Ignoring the threat, Keanu dragged him back toward the gas station. His arm ached, blood dripping down his sleeve, but he didn't care. All that mattered was finding Emily and getting her to safety. As he approached the edge of the woods, Emily's small figure emerged from behind a tree, her doll still clutched tightly in her hands. She looked up at Keanu, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "It's okay, Emily," Keanu said softly, crouching down despite the pain. "You're safe now." The girl hesitated for a moment before running into his arms, her tiny hands clutching at his shirt. Keanu lifted her, cradling her gently as he carried her back toward the gas station. Her trembling form pressed against his chest, and he felt her finally begin to relax. Behind him, Sarah appeared, her weapon drawn as she took custody of the accomplice. "You okay?" she asked, her eyes scanning Keanu's bloodied arm. "I'll live," Keanu replied, his focus still on Emily. "Let's just get her out of here." As they walked toward the waiting vehicles, Emily's grip tightened around his neck. The night had been brutal, but she was safe, and that was all that mattered. The fluorescent lights of the precinct cast a cold, sterile glow as Stephen Blake sat slouched in the interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the metal table. A faint smirk curled at the corners of his mouth, his expression smug and defiant. Across from him, Sarah Mills sat with her arms folded, her sharp eyes boring into him. "You're wasting your time," Stephen drawled, his tone dripping with arrogance. "Emily's my daughter. You're going to look real stupid when you figure that out." Sarah didn't flinch. She had seen men like him before, predators who hid their depravity behind masks of charm and lies. She flipped open a folder, sliding a picture of Emily across the table. "This is Emily Harper," she said coolly. "She's 7 years old. She was abducted 3 days ago from her front yard in Meadowville. Her parents are frantic, by the way. Care to explain how she ended up in your custody?" Stephen leaned back in his chair, his cuffs clinking against the table. "Already told you she's my daughter. We were just passing through town. Family visit, you know how it is." Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. She flipped another page in the folder, pulling out a copy of Emily's birth certificate. "Here's the thing, Stephen. We have already confirmed her identity with Meadowville PD. Her parents provided DNA samples, and Emily's been positively identified as their daughter. So let me ask you again, how did she end up in your car?" Stephen's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before returning. "Look, you've got it all wrong. I didn't abduct anyone. She came with me willingly." Sarah slammed her hand down on the table, the sound echoing through the small room. "Enough with the lies. You've been caught, Stephen. The girl is terrified of you. She didn't come willingly. She's a child, and you're nothing but a monster who preys on kids. The sooner you admit it, the better." Stephen's face darkened, his smirk fading entirely. "You don't know what you're talking about," he spat. "You think you're so smart, but you have no idea what's really going on." Sarah leaned in, her voice low and icy. "Then enlighten me." In the adjacent observation room, Keanu Reeves stood behind the one-way mirror, his hands balled into fists at his sides. He watched Stephen closely, every fiber of his being resisting the urge to burst into the room and confront him directly. The thought of what Stephen had done and what he had planned for Emily filled Keanu with a rage so intense it threatened to overwhelm him, but he knew he couldn't let his emotions take over. Emily was safe now, and his focus was on ensuring Stephen and his accomplice faced justice. He took a deep breath, his gaze shifting to the evidence table behind him. There lay the forged documents, Documents, fake birth certificates, driver's licenses, and custody papers, all meticulously crafted to make it seem like Stephen had legal guardianship of Emily. Under the floorboards of the motel room, they had found a stash of passports, each bearing the names and photos of different children, none matching the listed names. The most chilling discovery was a ledger filled with codes and amounts, a grim catalog of transactions pointing to a child trafficking operation. "This guy's been doing this for years," Sarah had said when they first uncovered the stash, "and he's not working alone." Back in the interrogation room, Sarah wasn't letting up. "We found the passports, Stephen. Dozens of them, all for children who aren't yours. And the ledger. It paints a pretty clear picture of what you've been up to." Stephen's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "You're part of a trafficking ring," Sarah continued, her voice cutting like a blade. "You abduct children, forge documents to make it look like they're yours, and then you sell them. How many kids have you done this to, Stephen? How many families have you destroyed?" Stephen finally snapped, slamming his fists against the table. "You don't know anything," he shouted. "You think you're some kind of hero, but you don't understand how this world works. Those kids don't you dare try to justify this," Sarah interrupted, her voice cold and unwavering. "These are children, not commodities. You're done, Stephen. We've got enough evidence to bury you and your accomplice." Stephen leaned back, his chest heaving with anger, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. He knew the walls were closing in. Outside the interrogation room, Keanu paced back and forth, the weight of the case pressing heavily on his shoulders. He couldn't stop thinking about Emily, how small and fragile she had seemed as she clung to him in the woods. She was safe now, reunited with her parents, but the thought of how close she had come to disappearing forever made his stomach churn. A voice broke through his thoughts. "Keanu." It was Sarah stepping out of the interrogation room. She looked tired but resolute. "He's not talking, at least not about the bigger operation. But we've got enough to charge him with Emily's abduction and at least a dozen other counts based on the passports and forged documents." Keanu nodded, his jaw tight. "And the accomplice?" Sarah sighed. "He's not saying much either, but the evidence ties them both to the same ring. It's a start." "It's not enough," Keanu Reeves had said, his voice low. "There are more kids out there. We need to take this operation down." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "We will, but we have to do it the right way. Rushing in without a solid case could blow this wide open and let the real players walk free." Keanu took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. She was right. As much as he wanted to act, they needed to build an airtight case, one that wouldn't just take down Stephen and his accomplice, but the entire network. Hours later, as Stephen was led out of the precinct in handcuffs, Keanu stood by the entrance, watching silently. Stephen's smug demeanor was gone, replaced by a sullen, defeated expression. The accomplice followed shortly after, his hood pulled low over his face. Keanu's chest tightened as he thought of the ledger, the names and photos of children who hadn't been as lucky as Emily. He promised himself he wouldn't stop until every one of them was found. As the cruiser carrying Stephen and his accomplice pulled away, Sarah walked up beside him. "You did good, Keanu," she said. "Emily's safe because of you." Keanu shook his head. "It's not enough. There are more kids out there, families who don't even know if their children are alive. And we're going to find them," Sarah said firmly, "but it starts here with these two." The morning light filtered through the precinct windows as Keanu Reeves stood in the observation room, watching Emily Harper sit with a child psychologist. She was still clutching her doll, the same one she had gripped tightly throughout the entire ordeal. Her small frame seemed even more fragile in the bright light of day, yet there was a quiet resilience in the way she sat, her fingers tracing the frayed stitching of the doll's dress. Keanu had seen enough in life to know that trauma left scars, invisible ones that could take years to heal. But seeing Emily there, safe and alive, was a moment he wouldn't forget. She was here because he didn't give up, because he trusted his instincts when it mattered most. A soft knock on the door behind him pulled him from his thoughts. Detective Sarah Mills stepped in, her face a mixture of exhaustion and relief. "Emily's parents just arrived," she said quietly. "They're in the waiting room." Keanu nodded, his chest tightening. "How are they?" "Terrified, relieved. Every emotion you can think of, Sarah replied. They're ready to see her. Keanu turned back to the glass, his eyes on Emily. She had been through so much in the past few days, and now she was about to be reunited with the people who loved her most. Let's bring them in, he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. The waiting room was small and sparsely furnished, but the tension inside was palpable. Emily's parents, Claire and Michael Harper, sat side by side, their hands tightly clasped together. Claire's face was pale, her eyes red and swollen from days of crying. Michael sat rigidly, his jaw clenched as though holding back a flood of emotions. When Keanu entered the room, Claire stood abruptly, her eyes searching his face for answers. Is she okay? Where is she? Can we see her? The words spilled out in a rush, her voice trembling with a desperation. She's okay, Keanu reassured her, his calm tone steadying the storm of emotions in the room. She's safe now. She's with a child psychologist, but she's ready to see you. Claire let out a sob of relief, covering her mouth with her hand. Michael stood, his grip tightening on Claire's shoulder as if to ground her. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with gratitude. Thank you for bringing our little girl back to us. Keanu nodded, motioning for them to follow him. As they walked down the hallway, Claire's steps quickened, her need to see her daughter overriding everything else. Keanu opened the door to the room where Emily sat, stepping aside to let them in. Emily, Claire whispered, her voice breaking as she stepped forward. Emily looked up, her big, tear-filled eyes meeting her mother's. For a moment, there was silence, as though time had frozen. Then Emily dropped her doll and bolted from her chair, throwing herself into her mother's arms. Mommy, she cried, her voice filled with a mix of relief and desperation. Mommy, I missed you. Claire crumpled to the floor, holding Emily tightly as sobs racked her body. I've got you, baby. I've got you. You're safe now. Michael knelt beside them, wrapping his arms around both of them, his own tears streaming down his face. We've got you, sweetheart, he murmured. We're never letting you go. Keanu stood in the doorway, his throat tightening at the sight. He had seen so much over the years, violence, loss, heartbreak. But this moment, this reunion reminded him why he did what he did. It was raw, unfiltered emotion, the kind of moment that stayed with you forever. When the family finally began to compose themselves, Emily turned her head, her eyes searching the room until they landed on Keanu. She pulled away from her parents, walking over to him with small, tentative steps. Her doll dangled from one hand, and with the other, she reached out to tug gently on his sleeve. Mr. Reeves, she said softly, looking up at him. Keanu crouched down so they were eye level. Yes, Emily? She hesitated for a moment, then wrapped her arms around his neck in a tight hug. Thank you for saving me. Keanu froze for a moment, the weight of her words hitting him like a freight train. Slowly, he brought his arms up, hugging her back. You're welcome, Emily, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You're a very brave girl. As she pulled back, she looked at him with a small, hesitant smile, the first he had seen from her since the ordeal began. It was a smile that spoke of trust, of hope, of the possibility of healing. I won't let another child go through what Emily did, Keanu Reeves has said, his voice firm. I don't care how long it takes or how high up this ring goes. We're going to dismantle it, piece by piece. Sarah raised her coffee cup in a small toast. To justice, Keanu lifted his own cup, the weight of his vows settling over him. To justice. The courtroom was packed, the tension suffocating. Journalists lined the back row, their cameras and notepads ready to capture every moment. Stephen Blake sat at the defendant's table, his usual smugness replaced by a hollow, defiant stare. Beside him, his accomplice was visibly more shaken, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Both men were flanked by their defense attorneys, but the overwhelming evidence left little room for hope. Keanu Reeves sat quietly in the gallery, his arm still in a sling from the injury he'd sustained during the chase in the woods. Initially, he hadn't wanted to come to the trial. Seeing Stephen's face again stirred a mix of anger and disgust that he struggled to contain. But he knew he had to see this through, for Emily and for the other children who hadn't been as lucky. The judge's gavel echoed through the room, silencing the murmurs. The jury filed in, their faces solemn as they took their seats. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his heart pounding. This was it. Weeks of tireless investigation, countless hours poring over evidence, and haunting memories of the case all led to this moment. The jury foreman stood, clearing his throat as he unfolded the piece of paper that would seal Stephen and his accomplice's fate. In the case of Stephen Blake and Matthew Carson, we find the defendants guilty on all counts, including kidnapping, conspiracy, and child trafficking. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by murmurs of relief. Emily's parents, seated a few rows ahead of Keanu, clutched each other tightly, tears streaming down their faces. Claire Harper whispered, "Thank God," over and over, while Michael closed his eyes, visibly overwhelmed. Stephen's expression hardened, his jaw clenching as he stared straight ahead. His accomplice slumped in his chair, defeated. The judge's voice cut through the noise, ordering the courtroom to remain quiet as she delivered their sentences. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. For a moment, Keanu allowed himself to exhale, the tension in his chest easing slightly. Justice had been served. But as the gavel struck again, signaling the end of the trial, he knew the work wasn't over. The weeks following the convictions were a whirlwind. Evidence uncovered during the investigation led to a series of raids across multiple states. Law enforcement agencies coordinated to dismantle the trafficking ring piece by piece. Every arrest brought the recovery of more children, a reminder of why Keanu had chosen this path. One afternoon, Detective Sarah Mills burst into Keanu's office, her face lit with rare excitement. She dropped a thick file onto his desk. "Another bust last night," she said. 3 more arrests and 4 kids rescued." Keanu flipped through the file, his heart lifting slightly at the sight of the children's faces. "Good work," he said, his tone subdued but sincere. "Every one of these arrests makes a difference." Sarah leaned against the doorframe, studying him. "You should feel proud, Keanu. This case wouldn't have broken open without you." He shook his head, closing the file. "It's not about me. It's about those kids, Emily and all the others. They're the ones who matter." Sarah nodded, understanding his perspective, but knowing he deserved more credit than he was willing to take. "Well, you did good, and I mean that." One quiet afternoon, weeks after the trial, Keanu found himself at a park near his neighborhood. His arm had healed, though occasional twinges reminded him of the ordeal. He sat on a bench, watching children laugh and play on swings and jungle gyms. It was a stark contrast to the memories that haunted him. Emily's terrified face, the shadowy woods, and the grim evidence from the motel. But it was also a reminder of why he fought so hard. Moments like this, where children could just be children, free from fear and harm. "Mr. Reeves," Keanu looked up to see Claire Harper standing a few feet away, holding Emily's hand. Michael trailed behind them, carrying a picnic basket. Emily's face lit up when she saw him. She broke into a run, her doll tucked under one arm. "Mr. Reeves," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around him in a hug. Keanu smiled, kneeling down to meet her. "Hey, Emily, how are you doing?" "I'm good," she said, her voice bright and confident. "Mommy and Daddy take me to the park now, and I'm starting school again soon." "That's great to hear," Keanu said, his voice soft. "You're a brave girl, you know that?" Emily grinned, holding up her doll. "And I still have her, too." Claire stepped forward, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "We can never thank you enough for what you did," she said. "You saved our little girl." Michael nodded, his voice steady but emotional. "If there's ever anything we can do for you, just say the word." Keanu shook his head, standing as he looked at them. "You don't owe me anything. Just keep being the amazing parents you are. That's all Emily needs." Claire hugged him briefly before stepping back, her voice thick with emotion. "You're a good man, Mr. Reeves. Don't ever doubt that." As the Harpers walked away, Keanu watched them for a moment, a small smile on his face. A sense of peace washed over him, something he hadn't felt in weeks. Emily was safe, her family was whole, and for now, that was enough. That evening, Keanu was back on patrol. The city streets stretched out before him, bathed in the orange glow of streetlights. The hum of his car's engine was a familiar comfort, but his eyes stayed sharp, scanning every car, every pedestrian, every shadow. He knew better than anyone how quickly danger could strike, how easily the unthinkable could happen. But he also knew how much of a difference one person could make. A single decision to trust a hunch, to take action, could change everything. Thanks for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, give the video a like and don't forget to subscribe for more.